So thanks
Hello,
so much
everyone,
for,
and thanks so much for being with us today. I'm going to hop in first, Jill, and then I'll let you in. My name is Merle Massey, and I'm the coordinator of the Undergraduate Research Initiative at the University of Saskatchewan. And this session about writing scholarship proposals is being recorded for the students in the Student Undergraduate Research Experience. And with us today, we have Jill McMillan, who is the Graduate Writing Specialist at the University of Saskatchewan. Jill, I call the SURE program the Merle and Jill show. I think that Jill and I have the most number of webinars, but that's because Jill is incredibly experienced and brings so much to the table and offers us her time. So with that, Jill, I will pass this directly over to you.
well, thanks again for inviting me to talk. This, our topic today is all about writing scholarship proposals. And frankly, it's one of my favorite things to talk about. So before I sort of fangirl about why I'm so enthused about this topic, just a quick introduction for those of you who don't know me. I see some familiar faces, or names rather. But if you don't know me, my name is Jill. If you ever have questions about writing, you are more than welcome to get in contact. You can send me an email, jill.mcmillan@usask.ca. If you're looking for one-to-one feedback on your writing, I also recommend that you become familiar with the Writing Help Center, which is a free service for all USask students. And then if you're looking for just a supportive community in which to make some progress on your writing projects, you're more than welcome to join our virtual write-ins. Our spring series just ended, but the write-ins will resume again in July, beginning July 12th, and will run Monday and Tuesday mornings, 9 to 10:30 a.m. So one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about this topic is because when I was a student, I really relied on scholarships. So I appreciate how important scholarships are to students. It really affected the trajectory of my academic life. And so I'm very motivated to try and point you in in some good directions for writing and creating strong scholarship applications. So our focus is as follows. Today, we're going to briefly look at how we might locate scholarships. And then I'm going to sort of identify two different types of scholarships that sort of exist. Those that are a bit more holistic and focused, and those that are more research focused. And we'll look at the two of these, spending more time looking at those research type of scholarships. And then we're really going to focus on how we can actually get our message across, identifying some of the rhetorical elements of successful proposals. Again, more with a focus on those research scholarships. And then we'll wrap up by identifying some help and supports. I also want to acknowledge that we have some excerpts that have been supplied by members of the USask community. So to thank and acknowledge those folks who have loaned their writing for the purposes of these resources. So how do we go about locating scholarships? Well, the number one resource that's available to you as a USask student is the scholarships and awards site on the USask webpage. And this is a database that collects lots of internal and external opportunities, and so you can navigate this resource. And I would encourage you to become very familiar with it and review it, and really start mapping out any scholarships or awards or bursaries that you might be eligible for, and noting those deadlines so you can start planning in advance, rather than try and put something together a little bit at the last minute. A couple of really big opportunities that are available to undergraduates who are entering their final year of study and are interested in pursuing a graduate degree are the McCall-McBain Scholarship, the Rhodes Scholarship, and the Gates-Cambridge Scholarship. So do be aware of some of these really interesting opportunities that exist. They are competitive, but there are supports available to help you put your applications together if you're interested in pursuing these sorts of opportunities. And you can connect with the Scholarship and Awards Office if you have questions about some of these awards. A couple of other resources that you might want to look at, especially if you are an international student or if you are someone who's interested in studying overseas. Of course, with COVID, some of this has been complicated a little bit, but within the next year or two, it might be that it's going to be a little bit easier to be globally mobile again. So EduCanada has lots of different scholarships that are available, both for international students as well as domestic students who wish to study abroad. And likewise, the Think Swiss Research Scholarship is a really interesting opportunity that's available both to domestic and international students who would like to study at a Swiss university for a period of time. Now, it does take time and effort to put together a strong application, and it can be easy to sort of think, oh, it's so competitive. Why should I even apply in the first place if there's no guarantee of success? Especially if you're identifying some of the smaller awards and scholarships in the, 200 to $500 range. You might wonder if it's worth the time and effort. And I think it always is. First of all, if you're able to obtain multiple small awards, they will actually add up to something fairly substantial. But there are these other benefits as well. So the process actually does become easier with practice. The more we write, just generally speaking, it's going to become easier for us to write in new contexts all the time. So going through that process of trying to gain mastery over text production within a certain genre. It's also a very useful way to reflect on what you've been doing over the last few years. And in doing so, help improve your elevator pitch. So when you are meeting new people, it's going to be a little bit easier to introduce yourself or your research to those new folks that you're encountering. And this is part of networking and also is part of the interview process for internships and employment opportunities. So the more comfortable you become speaking reflectively about who you are as a person and all the different things that you've done and all the qualities that you have, it just becomes easier to articulate that to different people in new environments and new situations. It's also a means of helping to build your reputation within your department or your university because some of those larger scholarships will go through an internal review. So even if you're not successful, if your application still stands out, it could make people a little bit more aware of who you are and what you have to offer, and that could lead to some interesting conversations. But ultimately, I think the number one reason why we should go through this process is because, to quote a very famous hockey player, Wayne Gretzky, you miss 100% of the shots you don't take. If you don't apply for any scholarships, any awards, any bursaries, you're not going to get them. Whereas if you're applying to them on a regular basis, you're going to increase your chances of actually getting some money. And that will then help you as you continue with your studies. So anytime you're eligible for a scholarship, for an award, for a bursary, put the effort in order to put that application together. So as I noted earlier when I was introducing our topic, you have sort of two trends that you'll see in different scholarships and awards when you start looking at the requirements. Some of them are much more holistic in terms of what they're asking of an applicant. And this means that they really want to consider who you are as a individual. They want to see that sort of rounded picture of who you are and why they should invest in you. Whereas um, other scholarships and awards have much more of a research focus where they have some interest in you, but they're much more interested in the work that you're currently doing in terms of research or research that you're proposing going forward. So you want to really read carefully to ensure you understand the perspective of the funding body to make sure that you are sort of meeting those expectations as you're pulling your applications together. Because that's, I think, some of the tricky element about scholarships and awards is that you have to personalize applications all the time. So you really have to deconstruct what's being asked and make the application fit. Here is a sample of a scholarship that is really interested in more of that holistic picture. And this is just from that scholarship and awards database that I was referencing earlier. This is the Rietenberg Family Foundation Bursary in Engineering. And there are a couple of different components. The first is bolded, and that's what we're going to look at in a little bit of detail. So it asks that you submit an essay of approximately 500 words on how this bursary will impact and assist your studies. Then there's other considerations. They want reference to demonstrated financial need, as well as certain expectations around a minimum average. Now, this is a really good bursary because not only is it several $1,000s, but you have the opportunity to renew it over a number of years as long as you're maintaining that average. So when you encounter scholarships, awards, or bursaries like that have that renewable component, that becomes very exciting because that can lead to greater stability when it comes to financing your studies. So my questions for you, and I would encourage you to contribute in the chat, and it'll take about 2 minutes to do this. How would you approach the writing of this short essay? What are some of the questions you might ask? What things would you mention? What might be valued by the people who are going to be making the decision? How would you go about answering this question? And it doesn't matter if you're not in engineering. You can make this fairly generic and think about how you would apply it in accordance with your area of study. But what are some of the things that you would want to pull in? And you can be as generic or as personal as you'd like. So let's take 2 minutes and contribute in the chat. Really great suggestions coming in. And if you're still typing away or a thought occurs, do feel free to add that. So we have making reference to previous work or research experience, making use of that personal voice, making reference to your personal life in relation to school, making reference to how this money will actually make it easier to be successful in the program, all of these sort of elements. And all that has to be done in 500 words. So making that sort of story come together in a very limited amount of text is going to be quite challenging. And so this is why you'll want to start your application several weeks before they are due, simply because that will give you the opportunity to get feedback on your writing, because you need to really maximize what's often a very limited word count in order to present your case to prospective funders. So similar to what a lot of you noted, I would suggest we have a range of possibilities that we could make reference to. So I might make some reference to past and continued successes, so highlighting some notable achievements that relate to my studies, to indicate that, I actually am a successful student, and you know that I'll have the ability to continue my studies, and that the investment will be a strong investment. I might position myself as the sort of engineer in the making. So make it quite specific to the area of study. I might reference topics that are of particular interest, any work that I've been doing to investigate these areas. I might reference motivations for entering the program. So if I have a particular interest in finding sustainable solutions to certain problems, that might be something that I would elaborate on. And I would reference some of that financial picture as well. So maybe making reference to how you're currently funding your studies. So are you working part-time? What how are you currently trying to juggle everything? Because if it's clear that you're really making the effort, but it is a struggle, then people might look at your application a little bit more favorably. And then referencing perhaps how those opportunities will open how certain opportunities will open up as a result of receiving funding. So maybe it's going to not only give you more time to study or research, but maybe it's going to allow you to put those studies or research into action in different ways. So maybe it's about trying to get involved in a community initiative. So there's lots of different ways in which you could approach the writing of an essay in response to a prompt like this. But what you'll want to do at the beginning of any application is really break down as much as possible the prompt in order to figure out how you want to answer it, and making sure that you do answer it, because that is a hazard if you don't. Now, one point of caution is that often students are incredibly modest, especially students who are applying for scholarships. Um, and this is where you need to actually learn how to own and value your experiences. You don't want to underestimate yourself. Um, so you want to ask lots of different questions as you approach your writing of your applications. You want to consider, well, do I have any particular scholastic or personal passions that I've been pursuing, and that I've been pursuing for a sustained period of time? Do I have any involvement with clubs or community groups? Do I have am I involved as a volunteer? Have I held full or part-time jobs? And the nature of this work isn't necessarily what's valuable, but your willingness to pursue different things and hold on to different experiences can often demonstrate, um, you know, a work ethic, or a sense of initiative, for instance. Have you held any leadership roles? So in school, for instance, are you part of a club? Do you have a leadership role within that club? Have you won any awards? And even if these are fairly small awards, it's going to reference the fact that other people have recognized some of the stuff that you've been doing. And especially when it comes to holistic applications, sometimes they really want to hear about the things that you have encountered, and faced and overcome, in your personal life. So, have you grown up in a remote area, for instance? And if so, what have been some of the implications for your learning? So maybe it's that, um, a lot of specialized classes simply weren't available to you. So perhaps you taught yourself to do things using YouTube as a resource. So you had to teach yourself because you just didn't have access to that formal education. Have you overcome some significant personal challenges? So these could be family challenges. These could be things to do with, um, physical ability, overcoming illness. So you have the scope within some of these applications to reference how you have managed or overcome challenges in your life. Because the fact that you've done that and you're now pursuing university studies says a lot about an individual in terms of their ability to persevere, and continue to push themselves. And that's something that funders are often quite interested in. Now, when it comes to those holistic applications, you do want to be mindful of some common errors. And I think the main one that emerges is the lack of a thoughtful engagement with the essay prompt. So if you produce a response that's actually quite generic, that's going to be of concern. And you might have done this as sort of a time-saving approach because you have, if you've located 4 or 5 scholarships that you're going to apply for, and they all sort of have these short essays that you have to complete, it might seem, well, I'll just make one little essay and I'll use it for all of them. Unfortunately, what happens is if that response has not then been personalized, funders are not going to feel connected to it. They're going to wonder, why haven't you actually answered the questions or the prompt that we've presented? And then they'll look at the other candidates a little bit more closely, the ones who seem to have engaged with the prompt more thoughtfully. Another really common error is that you use it as a space to list everything that you've ever done. Um, and a lot of you will have a lot of things that you can reference, a lot of extracurriculars, a lot of work experiences, voluntary experience, extra credit stuff, et cetera, et cetera. But usually in a package, you often get to attach a CV that provides an opportunity to indicate those awards that you've received in other contexts. And so if you're just taking that almost a list and translating it into prose, it's not going to be that effective because um, it's just going to seem like a CV, but in sustained prose as opposed to bulleted points. And so it becomes kind of boring to read, frankly, because we don't have a sense of who you are. And then another error is a lack of concrete supporting details. So, for instance, referencing personal qualities um, of yourself without indicating how we actually know that that is a good portrayal of who you are. So, for instance, if you say that you're someone who takes a lot of initiative, well, that's great, but can you provide a thoughtful detail that illustrates that claim that you're making about yourself? Because these people don't know you, so they need to understand why um, you that you are who you say you are. So you need to substantiate your claims with some detail. So the solution to pretty much all of these errors is to really approach the essay from a sense of narrative. So you want to write a cohesive narrative that has a very limited scope, that you're going to center on one or two key themes, because this will provide you the opportunity to engage with reflection and make connections between all of the details that you are surfacing to the committee. Because ultimately, often what we're looking for is an awareness that these specific events that you're referencing, these experiences, these achievements, they're meaningful beyond what um, their description suggests. So maybe they've inspired you to take on a new challenge, and then you'd explain what that new challenge was, for instance, because you went through personal growth as a result of having that experience. So you really want to be thoughtful in how you are approaching these sort of scholarships that are really interested in who you are as an individual. So now we're going to switch focus and we're going to look at scholarships that are really foregrounding research. So if you are someone who is planning on attending graduate school after your undergrad, then in all likelihood, you will be applying to Tri-Council funding. Um, a lot of graduate programs in Canada, if you are eligible to apply, they make it part of your acceptance where you have to agree to try and obtain Tri-Council funding. So you have to complete an application, whether or not you're that interested in doing so, if you are pursuing a research-based degree. And when we refer to the Tri-Council, it's basically in reference to these different federal funding agencies that provide money for graduate students and postdocs all across Canada. So we have the National Research Council, Canadian Institutes of Health Research, and Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council. And they provide MA and PhD scholarships as well as some funding for postdocs. We're going to focus on the MA scholarship because that's probably more of interest to you at this point in your academic career. So for a frame of reference, all universities in Canada, or most universities in Canada, receive a certain allotment of Tri-Council MA funding. as of 2019, for instance, USask had 5 awards for the Canadian Institute of Health Research, 23 SSHRC, and 21 NSERC awards. And so what happens is that you apply for these, and the decision actually happens within the university as to whether or not the student will receive these funds. And these are quite lucrative awards, so you do want to apply for them if you are entering a master's program at the university. If you're not sure of the agency because you are in an interdisciplinary area of study, for instance, then there are guidelines for selecting the appropriate federal granting agency on their website. The probably the more common degree that requires a bit of reflection is psychology, because psychology can cut across 2 of these agencies. And so you'd want to have conversations with your research supervisor to find out which agency would be the best choice for your proposed research. Now, the big question that we arrive at is, what are these agencies actually looking for in applications? Because they are highly competitive, because they are so lucrative. If you obtain one, you get a decent amount of money. So it's, in some ways, it's similar to some of the elements within those holistic scholarships, but where those were a bit more invested in who you are as a person as well as an academic, research-centered scholarships are much more interested in the project. They're interested in you, but from the lens of you being a researcher. So when it comes to the tri-councils, for instance, they really want to know, is this project going to advance knowledge? Is it going to be of some benefit to Canadians and other people around the world? Is there going to be an inspirational component here? So will scholars following you, will they be able to pursue research in an area that you have sort of been, that you've opened up? And are you going to be a good return on investment? If they're giving you X amount of money, are they going to, is that project guaranteed to be completed? So when it comes to that selection criteria, it is broken down in the following way. So 50% is all about academic excellence. So this is going to be captured through your academic record, any existing scholarships, awards, distinctions that you had at the time of application, the nature of your program and courses that you've taken in the past. And most of this information is going to be captured in your references, your transcripts, as well as your CV. And really what we're asking is, do you strive for academic excellence? So are you someone with a strong academic track record? This second category is research potential, and this is worth 30%. And it's asking, the focus is really on this sort of a combination of who you are and the research that you're describing. So the significance and the feasibility of the proposed research. So can it actually be done in the time that you say it's going to take? Because when it comes to research, sometimes early career scholars really underestimate the amount of time it takes to conduct research. So they might say, oh, I'm going to do this project. And in reality, it's a project that's going to take about 5 or 6 years. And they're proposing that they're going to do it within the length of a master's program, which is usually 1 to 2 years. So it just doesn't make sense. Do you have relevant work experience or academic training that is going to complement the project that you are proposing? Do you have notable research experience and achievements? So have you presented at a conference, for instance? Have you done a research rotation? And you could reference something like the SSHRC program, for instance, because you have been getting this sort of holistic grounding in the research process at the undergraduate level in preparation potentially for graduate school. And so this information is going to be captured in both the referee comments as well as that research proposal, which is what we are really going to focus on in the rest of today's session. But ultimately, we're asking, are you a motivated and capable researcher? And then finally, personal characteristics and interpersonal skills. So this is where we're actually pulling in that more holistic component, similar to some of those scholarships that we were looking at earlier that really foreground the holistic perspective. So what kind of work and volunteer experience do you have? Do you have any project management experience? How involved are you in academic life? Do you have the ability to communicate concepts clearly and logically in written as well as oral formats? And this is going to be captured via those those referee comments, the research proposal, as well as your CV. And what we're asking here, the sort of subtext is, can you actually complete the work that you say you're going to complete? And if you're going to be working with a research team, is that going to be successful? So it's really about drawing on past experiences, past successes, and framing them in a future-oriented way. As I noted previously, in terms of who actually makes the decisions for the Tri-Council funds at the master's level, it's going to happen within the university. So it's going to be composed of about 4 to 5 university members, and they're going to be reviewing these applications, and then they're going to score them based on the evaluation criteria. So sort of like a rubric in a sense. And then they're going to generate scores and create relative ranking of applications. And so based on how people are scoring, you might have some years where there are a lot of very, very, very strong applications. And so it's going to be harder to obtain those funds, and other years where maybe the quality of applications are a little bit lower and it might be easier to be higher up in that ranking. So it's just based on what's happening year to year. A lot of scholarships will require that you ask for references or referees. It's a bit more formal with the Tri-Council, but certainly I think this is good advice regardless of when it comes to looking for those references or referees. I recommend that you choose the people who are going to write on your behalf very carefully, and also approach them early. I would say give at least 3 weeks notice in advance of due dates if they have agreed to write that letter at all. And they're going to comment on things like academic excellence, research potential, and personal characteristics. You will not have access to these letters unless your referee shares it with you, but they are submitted confidential these are confidential documents. But the best letters are ones that really highlight who you are and support any claims about who you are as a researcher or as a person with concrete examples. The best references for a research-driven scholarship are going to be your academic or research supervisors, so someone who has academic credibility and direct experience working with you. Whereas for one of the more holistic scholarships, they might actually look for a recommendation from a community member, for instance, in order to craft that more rounded perspective of who you are as an individual. If possible, it's always useful to meet to discuss your application. So even if you're not going to see the letter, this is an opportunity for you to remind that person of the different experiences that they might wish to reference in drafting their document. And through that conversation, they might even make some suggestions about how you should approach your application. So it can be a very valuable conversation to have. You have to be sort of mindful, but also sensitive of follow-up communication, because someone has agreed to do this for you. but they might be juggling some other tasks. But it is very fair if you haven't heard from them and they have agreed to write that letter, to follow up with them, just a quick courtesy email to see the status and get a sense of when that's going to go out. I really like this article. It's a bit older, but it's a very useful letter on how to ask for a reference letter. It was published on University Affairs in March of 2009. So if you're looking for more advice on how to ask for that reference letter, do feel free to look at that article. When it comes to Tri-Council, they have quite a detailed application package that you need to pull together. But there is some variation across agencies. And then when you're thinking about scholarships more broadly, there's going to be a range as well. But the Tri-Council sort of expectations are good to have as a benchmark because they ask for the most. And so if you know that standard in advance, it can be easier to scale down for other funding bodies. So having that awareness can just make it easier to frame all of your applications. But broadly speaking, you're looking at academic transcripts. Double check to see if these can be submitted a digital transcript or if it has to be a formal paper one, because it can take universities quite a while to pull your transcripts together, and there's often a cost attached. So just be mindful. And you would need transcripts from all of the universities that you've attended. So if you were a transfer student, for instance, or if this is your second undergrad, you would need to pull from both schools. You'll need those reference letters or at least contact information, summaries of awards, scholarships, distinctions, any research contributions or statements, relevant professional and academic experience, so conference presentations. If you are applying for the Tri-Council, a Tri-Council award at the master's level, you'll have to complete what's known as the Canadian Common CV. Most people do not like it, but it is a requirement, or it was recently. And then a description of proposed research, and that's what we're going to focus in on for the rest of our session. So this is all about how we get our message across. And I share this quote from a professor at the University of Toronto because I love it. It says so much. Good writing will not save bad ideas, but bad writing can kill good ones. And I think that's the truth. If the research project is actually fundamentally flawed in some way, it doesn't matter how well you write about it. If someone can see the concerns, the limitations immediately, the quality of your prose won't matter. But if you have a really interesting research project that's actually quite innovative or exciting or important, then if this importance hasn't actually been communicated effectively, it's not going to get funded. So you want to make sure that the quality of your writing is matching how awesome you are or your project is, and often both. So one way to think about the proposal is that of a persuasive text. It's all about selling your project and sort of by extension yourself when it comes to a research-driven scholarship, because you want to really convince your reader that this work is important, it's significant, it's going to be valuable. So it's a piece of argumentative writing. The subtext of any scholarship proposal is I deserve money because, or you should give me money because. You're not going to write this in your proposal, um, whether it's a holistic proposal or a more research-driven one, but that is the subtext of what you are writing. You know that, and the person who's going to be reading your work will know that. So keep it at the forefront of your mind to remind yourself that you are asking for money, and you need to ensure that people feel that yes, you deserve this money. So that's sort of the dance that we find ourselves in. Keep in mind that readers may not actually be specialists in your field. So if you are writing about really technical information, you have to be very cautious about how you are framing that, because someone might not actually understand and it can be a bit alienating or off-putting. So you want to be quite plain in how you are framing some of this specialized vocabulary in order to ensure that folks are going to be really concerned about the takeaways of your text. So you want to sort of balance this showing off without being obnoxious. You want to highlight who you are as a researcher. You want to indicate that you are prepared to carry out this project, that you have a specific insight that's going to help this project be successful. If you have any relevant working relationships, it would be worth highlighting. So if you have connections with the national or international organizations, for instance, so relevant community groups or research institutes, that would be something to highlight, as well as any participation in different groups. So for instance, if your research has a strong social justice component to it, and you're involved in a local social justice organization, that would actually be worth referencing, because it would show that you are already likely thinking about how your research is going to turn into action at some point. When we think about academic writing and proposal writing, there are a lot of key differences. We won't go through all of them, but I do want to highlight some of these points of contrast. So academic writing tends to be past oriented, proposal writing is future oriented. Um, Academic writing is often theme centered, proposal writing is very project centered. There might be a lot of theory or a thesis in academic writing. We're much more interested in objectives and activities. Academic writing, we often have a lot of words that we can play around with. Often proposals have very, very strict length constraints, so very limited word count. Academic writing often features some insider jargon. Proposal writing needs to be more easily understood. So here we have sort of the general components of or any sort of research proposal. My question to you, which question is the most important? So our first component, identify problem research questions and or hypotheses. What are you investigating? What do you plan to achieve? Second, context and background information. What should the reader know? Why does it matter? And lastly, methodology and research design overview. How will you investigate? From your perspective, which question do you think is the most important? Let's take a minute and contribute in the chat. This is a bit of a subjective question to ask, but I would suggest that why does it matter is going to be the most important question, because this is where you are speaking to those folks outside of your field potentially, and you are helping them to become more aware of why your project is going to have value. So if you sort of center a lot of your proposal around this, answering this question, it's going to make it much more straightforward for someone to understand why you're doing what you're doing. Of course, you have to address the other components as well, but almost beginning at this point of reference can be a way to um, start structuring your document. Another thing to be mindful of is this notion of knowledge to impact. This kind of phrasing is becoming quite trendy in academia. And in simplest terms, it asks, why is the research important? Similar to that question we were looking at on the previous slide. So we're asking, how is it going to advance knowledge in the field? How is it going to solve a problem that needs to be solved? How is it going to contribute to some positive change in the world? You don't have to answer all of those questions. Depending on the nature of the research that you're doing, it is about advancing knowledge within quite a narrow field, but that it is going to push scholarship forward in that field in an exciting way. Ultimately, though, you want to be as concrete and as specific as possible to ensure that a reader is going to have a clear understanding of how research might link to action in the future. So it's all about really trying to show your plan in order to garner trust from your readers, because you're asking for money, and you want to show that you are someone who is trustworthy because you know how to implement it in order to produce a certain product. So we're going to look at two little excerpts from some research proposals. I'm going to ask, which version would you actually give money to and why? So we'll look at version 1 and version 2. Version 1 reads as follows. Pet cats are known menaces, and controlling them is necessary if we are to protect local species. The proposed project will involve the distribution of special cat collars that are meant to make these predators more visible to the songbirds that they stalk and kill, and whose population they have decimated over the last 100+ years. While this is less drastic than some would recommend, including researchers who recommend a complete cull of all domestic cats in the country, it is hoped that this intervention will be sufficient to protect local bird species. To encourage pet owners to put these special collars on their pets, we've partnered with our local council to encourage pet owners to do so. This is anticipated to be a challenging project, especially as New Zealanders love domestic animals, dogs and cats, but will be worthwhile once bird populations increase. It is expected that the populations of birds will increase significantly once these interventions are introduced. This is important for many reasons. In particular, it will protect local songbirds from extinction and preserve their existence for future generations. Okay, so that is version 1, all about trying to ensure that cats stop eating birds. Let's look at the second version, looking at the same topic. Ongoing debates about domestic cat ownership in New Zealand have centered on the devastating impact on local wildlife, specifically small birds, whose populations have plummeted following the introduction of domestic cats by European settlers in the late 18th century. Given that declining bird populations are associated with broader ecological instability, it is imperative that we take action to protect and restore bird numbers to maintain a healthy ecological system for generations to come. While some scholars argue that a wide-scale cull is urgently required to protect indigenous bird species, including the iconic flightless kiwi, others argue that less drastic action is needed. Given the self-proclaimed identity of most New Zealanders as pet lovers, as reported in several national surveys, my research responds to this emerging crisis by proposing a two-pronged approach that will accommodate the competing perspectives of pet owners and environmentalists. My project involves 1, the distribution and use of high-visibility cat collars, and 2, a local public awareness campaign to encourage pet owner compliance. The success of this project, which is a joint venture between my research team and the Otago Regional Council, will be judged on whether this intervention correlates with increased bird numbers in the region over a 3-year period. So which of these would you give money to and why? Version 1 or version 2? Let's take a minute or so and contribute in the chat. This emerging preference for the second example. And it's probably because, as some of you have noted, it is sort of creating a more convincing argument. And it's being a lot more specific in terms of providing concrete detail. And I think it's helping to communicate why this project has merit more effectively. The projects themselves, they're pretty comparable. It's just that we have greater detail and a better rationale in the second version. Because we understand it's not just about protecting these pretty birds and preserving them, it's recognizing that they're an important part of an ecological system. And if those birds populations continue to decline, that's going to be really harmful, not just for the birds, but for those broader systems. So it's not we don't have a lot of text here, but we're actually maximizing every sentence in order to ensure that all of the detail is being communicated in a fairly effective way. So we have that initial research context that is identifying not just a geographical um, frame of reference, but also some historical reference and that initial introduction to the problem. But the problem and purpose is really solidified in that second sentence. We move into just a preview of the scholarly conversation in terms of what different academics have been saying, and then identifying our project as this potential solution. So this sort of problem solution model is highly effective in many different writing contexts, but when it comes to argumentative or persuasive writing, problem solution is a structure that you can fall back on time and time again. And then we have some reference to how this project will actually be undertaken. And so it communicates a plan that is fairly easily understood, even though we would want more detail in a larger document. But it still provides enough oversight for us to recognize that, okay, they actually do have these steps in place. They'll be able to start with this project pretty quickly. There won't be a lot of delay before the project starts. Depending on the context, if you have the opportunity to provide an image or a table or a figure, that can be helpful, especially if you are communicating to a non-specialist. So this is simply an example of a cat with a special cat collar that helps to deter cats from sneaking up on those birds. So it becomes just an easy point of reference for those people who are reading your text. So again, it's all about making a case. You want to ask yourself, have I engaged readers sufficiently in the first few lines? Have I created a strong first impression? If you're uncertain about how to actually make this impression, you might ask yourself, well, can I tell a compelling story? Making use of cars moves can be very effective. I've spoken about these rhetorical moves in a couple of different workshops. It refers to create a research space. If you're not familiar with this and would like to know more, just get in touch with me and I'll send you some resources. You can also connect your previous research to this new research that you want to do when possible, if there are those links that exist. Making reference to how the research is going to link to public concerns can be very, very effective to help people be more interested in what you are working on. And then if you have a funding agency or body that has different goals that they have prioritized, then you can make reference to that in your text as well. So for instance, if you're applying for Tri-Council funding, these agencies actually have very explicitly stated what their priority areas are. So one has 30 different areas, one has 11, one has 16. So you could go and see if your project actually links to any of those areas. And if it's sensible to make that connection, then do so. So we're going to look at two very short pieces of writing for our next activity as we start to wrap up today's session. And I'd like you to reflect on how effective do you find these first few lines in terms of how they are presenting themselves and engaging their intended readers. So our first excerpt is as follows, and as we read through, I'd like you to ask yourself, what do you like or don't like about the example, and to contribute in the chat. So it reads as follows. Just as the National Sciences and Engineering Research Council is committed to excellence through innovation for the benefit of Canadians, my research will be committed to advances in transportation engineering through mechanic material characterization to build and manage road infrastructure that will perform better, last longer, and employ practices that are environmentally sustainable. So what do you like or don't like about this example? Let's take a minute or two and contribute in the chat. There's a little bit of subjectivity when it comes to evaluating writing, because we're going to gravitate to some things more than others, and that's fine. The more we go through that process of thinking about what we like or don't like about someone else's writing can help us to refine how we want to present our own ideas and develop our own style of expression. So we have some clear links to the funding agency. Um, Maybe that could be positioned elsewhere in the document. This is really just an introduction to a larger text. but it's doing a lot in what is effectively one long sentence. So we have very clear links to NSERC's mandate. We have quite clear benefits of the research stated from the very beginning. So we don't have uh, an extended preamble before we actually understand why the project might be valuable. It's stated within the topic sentence. And we also have some connections to contemporary concerns. So connections to this notion of sustainability, which in a Canadian context, if you are familiar with potholes in a lot of different roads, regardless of where you are in the country, you might be very interested in this kind of project that's claims it's going to actually improve road infrastructure, but from a sustainable approach. So it's sort of taking an existing problem and proposing a solution that is attractive because of its environmental sensitivity. So that can be quite an effective way to introduce your project, is to, from the beginning, really stating the benefits of your research and connections to a contemporary concern, for instance. We're going to look at one more example. The following reads as follows. My proposed research is urgent for three principal reasons: a critical need to curtail social distance between Indigenous and non-Indigenous populations in rapidly changing urban prairie environments, a prevailing omission of Indigenous presence in Saskatoon's and Regina's civic forums and public spheres, and a lack of attention paid to existing and potential intersections between mainstream city planning and the emergent paradigm of Indigenous planning in Canadian cities. So similar to our previous example, what do you like or don't like about this example? We'll take a minute or two and contribute in the chat. The word urgent is sort of a byword for importance and value. So we have a sense of something has to happen quickly. And so that might attract the interest of a reader. We have the organization of everything via a parallel structure that's sustained throughout. So when reading it, even though there's a lot of really complex information here, it's still organized in such a way that it's still quite readable. And we have a sense, again, of the importance. This is just, again, one sentence. We are positioning urgency and problems. We don't actually have a solution at this point. But that's fine, because what we really want to focus on is getting our reader interested early on in the reading process. So because we're often primed to anticipate that there will be solutions referenced later, referencing the problem in and of itself at the beginning can be enough to intrigue us. But if we don't have reference to solutions as the document progresses, that's where it might become a little bit of a concern. But we have those benefits, that importance of the research very clearly stated via reference to these existing problems or concerns. And these problems, though, are actually in some ways framed as being of benefit in relation to the project itself, because it's anticipated that we're going to actually um, find out information. We're going to learn something about how to minimize these problems or to address these problems in a more substantial way. And this has been expressed via that parallel structure. So we have a critical need, a prevailing omission, a lack of attention. And so that is helping us to just move from each section in the sentence to the next. So we always do want to be mindful of the fact that we're writing something for readers. We're writing for people who want to give us money, but we're also in competition with other people who want money. So we want to ensure that we are writing as clearly as possible. When it comes to a research proposal within a scholarship proposal. Making use of simple future tenses can help to convey confidence and create this sense that you have a lot of certainty about how you are going to approach your investigation. You want to minimize abstractions, so be more concrete with how you're presenting information. So researchers have discovered that is often stronger than writing something like "it has been discovered that." So actually putting the actors more explicitly in those sentences can help a lot. You can make use of paragraphing formatting and font to visually guide readers. You want to be mindful of what that visual first impression is going to be. So don't try to play around with margins and reduce font in order to put more information in. That's just going to annoy a reader. So you want to be mindful if you have to adhere to a 12 font, for instance, Times New Roman, that you're not going to reduce it to 11.5 in the hopes that someone's not going to notice. They will notice. So you just want to be mindful of what that product will look like. Additional tips for engaging readers include making use of sentence length and type to maximize the reading experience, making use of the first person. People want to fund you, not some sort of abstract entity. So you can use that personal voice. Make use of the active voice when possible, use shorter words when possible, use action verbs. This is going to help to communicate a plan rather than a hope. Avoid acronyms and jargon. These bits of advice will also potentially help you to reduce wordiness. And the more words that you're able to eliminate from each individual sentence, the more space you carve out in order to provide an additional example or an additional piece to your argument. So it will help you to maximize the space to advance your case for funding. If you're applying for Tri-Council funding, for instance, you might have to be mindful of having a communication plan as part of your project. So how are you actually going to share your work? And increasingly they're interested in communication that goes beyond traditional academic publishing, so beyond articles or conferences, for instance. So if you're applying to an organization that has a very strong community focus, they might ask or be interested in how you are going to engage the community in your research after you've finished your project. So you might think about how you could share work with community partners, for instance, how you could present information in different civic forums. You might have a more creative aspect to your project. And so you might have an art installation, for instance, or you might have some sort of web presence. So you might have a podcast. You might try and get interviewed by the radio, et cetera, et cetera. Because again, increasingly funding agencies are interested in how your work is going to impact people in a meaningful way. So they want you to have a sense of why your work is significant beyond a university context. So keep in mind as well, the initial vision that you have, it can actually change, it can modify. Usually, depending on the context, once you receive the money, unless it's stipulated within your within the offer, there might not actually be a lot of significant follow-up. So you can actually change the project if it needs to change. So in terms of some help and supports, if you are applying for Tri-Council scholarships, I really encourage you to look at the USask CGPS Scholarship Toolkit. This is a relatively new resource, but it provides some insight into going through this process. Likewise, there's a USask grant proposal repository where you can look at proposals across multiple disciplines. It requires your NSID login. And I really, really like Northwestern University. It's in the United States, so it's a different cultural context, but they have examples across multiple disciplines of successful grant proposals and scholarship proposals that have been annotated to give you insight into how someone actually engages with that kind of text. So it's a really great resource to look at. Finally, make use of your people resources, so supervisors, professors, departmental secretaries, your peers, CGPS, as well as the Writing Help Center. So if you're looking to get feedback on what that application reads as, you could submit it to get some feedback from a tutor. And then just a couple of general grant writing resources, more targeted to those Tri-Council scholarships. So there is lots of information available to you, and I encourage you to make use of those. Ultimately, it's what's really important, start early, because as with any piece of writing, you'll end up going through multiple drafts. So the earlier you start, the easier it will be to go through that process without being overwhelmed because you have 1,000 other things going on. Double check, triple check all of the requirements, turn it into a checklist so you can cross-reference and make sure that you're addressing everything. Um, it's so easy to miss a component. Double check keywords in the essay prompt, for instance, if that is part of the application that you're putting together, to make sure that you've actually answered the question, for instance, and seek out feedback from people within your discipline and outside of your discipline so that you can really get a sense of how readable and understandable your writing is, and just be prepared to rewrite and restructure accordingly. So multiple drafts are the norm. So just a final reminder of the different services and supports that are available here at the University Library. I apologize for going over time. I added in some new information and it threw me off a little bit, but hopefully it was still of value to you today.
Jill, your work is always of value. It's just fantastic, and the recording, of course, is a little bit smaller as well, simply because I always pause when we're contributing in the chat. Jill. Thank you very much for that session. I'm going to stop the recording, but if anyone has any additional questions, now is your time to ask them.